Part of the thought primer work that you're going to be submitting to me is going to require that you evaluate an argument for soundness, and I want to go over exactly what that means here. The argument you're going to be evaluating is derived from a news story about an event that occurred on the campus of USC, the University of Southern California, about 6 years ago, and the article that reported on this event is this one. A professor at the University of Southern California has come under fire after sending a reply all email last week to the student body stating, quote, accusers sometimes lie. Quote, if the day comes you are accused of some crime or tort of which you are not guilty, and you find your peers automatically believing your accuser, I expect you'll find yourself a stronger proponent of due process than you are now, Professor James Moore wrote in an email. Quote, accusers sometimes lie. According to Tony Araxinen of PJ Media, Moore's email was in response to a Believe All Survivors email that led to hundreds of emails from students and alumni who were concerned. Nearly 100 students reportedly attended a rally called Time's Up for James Moore on Monday in protest of Moore, who's tenured, demanding that he be fired. The students marched to Dean Jack Knott's office, who later addressed the crowd, telling them, quote, what Professor Moore sent was extremely inappropriate, hurtful, and insensitive. We're going to try to do everything we can to try to create a better school to educate the faculty. All right, so that's the event. Now, I've extracted out of this what I think is a fair representation of the argument that the students are making here, and I've expressed it as a standard form categorical syllogism. And here's what it looks like. All claims of sexual assault are claims that should be believed. No claims that should be believed are claims that should be questioned. Therefore, no claims that should be questioned are claims of sexual assault. Okay, so now, first what we're going to do is we're going to determine, is this actually even a valid argument? And to do that, we're going to make sure we identify that our major premise appears first, our minor premise appears second, our middle term appears in both premises but not the conclusion, and we can see that this is set up correctly in standard form. So now we want to know, is this argument valid? Well, let's find out where our distributed terms are so that we can apply the rules. Our first premise is an A statement. Those always distribute the subject term. The second premise is an E statement, which distributes both the subject and predicate terms. And so is the conclusion. It is also an E statement, which distributes its subject and predicate terms. Rule number 1 requires that the middle term be distributed at least once, and we can see that it is right here in premise number 2. Rule number 2 requires that if we have any terms distributed in the conclusion, and we do, both the subject and the predicate terms, they have to be distributed in premises, and they are. And rule number 3 says you cannot have 2 negative premises, and we don't. Premise number 1 is affirmative. And rule number 4 says if you have a negative premise, which we do, you have to have a negative conclusion, which we do. And rule number 5 says you can't have 2 universal premises and a particular conclusion, and that's not the situation here. So that proves this argument is a valid argument, right? It's an argument in the form of AEE figure 4, and that form of argument appears in our unconditionally valid argument inventory. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, what we want to know is this argument sound? And this is what that means. Are both premise statements of this argument true statements? Or do we have reasons for doubting that one or both of the premise statements is true? And this matters because, as we just determined, this argument is valid, which means that if these premise statements are true, there is no way for this conclusion to be false. We will have to accept the premise statement as a true statement if we accept both premise statements as true statements. But if we think we have good justification for rejecting one or both premise statements, then we don't have to accept the conclusion. Okay, so this argument is valid. The question on the table for us now is it sound? Are both the premises true? And so what you're doing in your thought primer is you're going to offer a brief explanation for why you believe this argument is either sound or unsound. In other words, why you believe the premises are either both true or why you believe that one or more of the premises is a false statement.